on this conflict. Now, I think it was critical for the Ugandan government to make sure that it was not portrayed as being a contributor to the conflict, but rather as the good guy,
Right.
and the Joseph Kony as the bad guy. The very simplistic narrative, good, bad. And somebody, I believe, convinced Invisible Children that it was in their interest to help promote this construct, make this the narrative. And that's the narrative that Invisible Children went with, and it was best exemplified with Kony 2012, because they have been to Uganda many times. They're certainly aware of the human rights abuses by the regime.
Right.
And I would invite people that care about Uganda and the plight of children in Africa, because now the U.S. troops would be authorized to go into Central African Republic as well. And to get there, you might also end up in southern Sudan.
Many areas.
Many areas. Mm-hmm. So I think we should be very wary of an organization that claims it wants to do good, save the children, while promoting militarization of that region, which happens to be very convenient for the regime,
mm-hmm.
and also very convenient for United States policymakers, because the other thing that's not being addressed in this picture is that there's a competition for energy sources and raw material sources between the United States and China.
China, right.
And China also has a presence in the Sudan.
Mm-hmm.
And that's problematic now for China, because since South Sudan became independent and most of the oil is in South Sudan,
mm-hmm.
There's a chance that China may not have access to that anymore. And as you know, there's almost a state of war right now between South Sudan and Khartoum.
Right.
Because they need that oil too. I think they're 90% dependent on oil revenue. And that was part of the challenge of independence. How could they have independence without war if there's an opportunity that there would not be a oil formula
right.
for sharing
for the equitable distribution.
Exactly,
right.
of the oil revenue. So right now, in fact, they're not producing oil in South Sudan because of the dispute on how to.
And George Kony was arrested today.
Yes, in fact, I saw the news,
DC,
right.
At the Sudanese embassy.
Right.
And it's because of this crisis. That's why he was arrested, because
right.
a Bay region that was supposed to hold a plebiscite after the Southern Sudan's independence are now the next enemies of North Sudan.
Right.
Or the main Sudan.
Right.
The atrocities they committed in Darfur is now, and all their guns and the Hellfire missiles are now facing these people from Abyei.
Right.
When I saw it's a little video, you could see people living like rodents.
Right.
They had to dig holes to cover themselves and put, all kinds of rubbish.
Right.
To close the doors of the holes that they're living in, so that when the soldiers are passing by, they wouldn't know that they are living down there.
Yeah. But
Mr. Alemari, you just painted a grim picture. That is just Uganda, the Congo, that circle there.
Right.
What is happening to Africa?
Okay. I am glad you put it in that context. Even though I paint a grim picture, I paint this grim picture not to demoralize people. I paint this grim picture, in fact, to energize people.
Okay.
And to point people at the right direction, that we should not allow outsiders to take advantage of our calamities that often, by the way, is not totally instigated by people in Africa. So we should always be aware of that,
Right.
number one. But number two, I think this is the most compelling reason that we need to go back and listen to some of the messages that were popularized in Africa at the dawn of independence, which is that if there's any imperative, anything to prove that we need to have really common policies that benefit the collective, a sort of a Pan-African approach, I don't see any better example, because right now we have surrendered our sovereignty to outside interests that work often with so-called presidents in African countries who are in many cases illegitimate. And when I say illegitimate, it's because if you're not in office based on the will of the people, if there's no regular mechanism to transition to a new leader on a specific dateline, then I call that a legitimate leadership. You can't have a constitution that has a term limit, and then when the end of your limit is approaching,
You shifted.
you shift the goalpost. You're in a position to rewrite the Constitution, which is precisely what has happened and I keep going back to Uganda because I'm most familiar with that situation.
Right, but it happened in
Absolutely.
Senegal too.
It happened in
Just
Senegal
quite
recently, And I think until we resolve these issues, we are always going to be really behind the bend, behind the curve. We are at least 50, 60 years removed from the end of colonial rule.
Right.
But if one of the early post-colonial leaders were to come back today, I don't believe that many of them would believe that these countries are independent, to be honest with you. So we need to find a way to realize that we need to work together. In fact, the idea of the EC, the European Union, that was an African idea.
Right.
African countries in the 60s were the first to talk about having a common political collective, to have common markets,
Right.
and eventually to all merge as one huge political and economic power. We were having this conversation way, way before the Europeans, and I'm sure they studied a lot of the documents that African leadership had been developing at that time. But there was a difference. I think coming out of the long period of colonial rule,
Right.
and the euphoria that carried the first group of leaders into office, and they knew what the people were demanding. The people wanted to see a new dawn. People wanted to see economic development. People wanted to end years of exploitation, humiliation, and degradation.
Right.
So that's what was pushing the momentum toward Pan-African unity. But today, where will the energy come from? Where will that push come from? And I think young people, not only here in the United States, we saw what young people did
Right.
in terms
South
of
Africa,
electing, helping to elect the first African American president.
Yes.
When they used the social media and the technology to make sure they were paying attention to what was being said in the debates, galvanizing, coming out and voting.
Right.
And I think we need to try to find a way to duplicate that approach in the African continent. We should begin with making it difficult for any illegitimate president to continue their regime. in Africa. Because being a president is not being a CEO of your private company.
No, no.
It is not.
No.
And often that's how they treat it. They sign deals with foreign interests that's not vetted by parliament, with preposterous equity rates, with their country getting a marginal portion of the shares, and they're allowed to do that. How can somebody that's not legitimate be authorized to negotiate with institutions like the World Bank?
Well, he's gonna, if he
or the
negotiates,
IMF.
he's negotiating for himself.
Yeah. Would we allow a legitimate president in the United States to negotiate loans on behalf of the United States with foreign organizations? We wouldn't even allow it here with a legitimate president.
Right.
You know, look, market forces have resulted in Chinese money from China coming into the United States, right?
Yes.
And even then, the president is always challenged. Why are we so dependent on China when he has nothing to do with it? You know, you work in a certain kind of economic system, and that's how it works. So even for legitimate flow of resources like this, you know, he's even sometimes criticized. So can you imagine if he were to go saying things are bad in the United States, let me go to China and negotiate for a loan and have China give us conditions? Can you imagine? If we don't tolerate it here, why should we tolerate it in Africa?
You know, a mentor of mine was a personal secretary to Kwame Nkrumah when he was in exile in Guinea.
Yes.
And you used the word euphoria. And he told me something about that word euphoria. If you remember Kwame Nkrumah's independence statement that the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it's linked up with the total liberation of the African continent.
Correct.
What Nkrumah was doing was actually cautioning Ghanaians not to be euphoric. Because to be euphoric would mean that they will sit down and then say, okay, we are free, Africa is free.
Everything will come together.
Yeah, so that was the purpose of that speech. Europeans took it as if Nkrumah was about to embark on a war with them, and which was good for Africa. You know what I mean? But his main objective was to caution Ghanaians not to be euphoric. And you just given this example about when we got our independence, how we felt. But you see, but not all the leaders of Africa had this idea that, you know, this is a long fought thing. We have slavery. We just came out of slavery. 1884 Berlin Conference that put us in this bind. And we're just getting this new freedom. We should be careful how to manage it. If Museveni came to power because of Idi Amin, can you imagine even hearing about dictatorship in Uganda?
No, I mean, these are the challenges we have. But I insist. I think young people can do amazing things. Let's take the video, CON 2012, for example. We have been critical of these kind of organizations even before this video came. So when it came out, we wrote a very critical editorial, which is now, I think the headline was CON 2012, Invisible Children's Pro-AFRICOM and Pro-Museveni video, something like that. That was the headline, and that was the substance of it. And that editorial is now on more than 200 websites.